Hello, welcome back to the Coffee Studio. Today we are going to continue on our journey of understanding coffee bags in order to know what it is that you like. Today we are going to be looking at processing methods. Ta-da! Post-harvest processing methods. Traditionally, in an ideal world, they preserve the quality of a high-quality fruit and they uphold food safety standards. In a more modern sense, what we're seeing in the coffee processing world is a lot more experimental processes such as carbonic maceration, anaerobic and aerobic fermentation, and lactic fermentation. These more experimental coffee processing methods can create flavors that weren't there before within the coffees, and they can also add immense value. So what this means is that when you see on a bag of coffee processing, we are referring to one of the most important aspects of how that coffee actually tastes. Every single farm or processing station or washing station or production farm will have different ways to process each of the coffees within these main categories. We have three main traditional processes: washed or wet processed. On the other end of the spectrum, we have dry or natural processed, and then in the middle kind of the two, we have honey or pulped natural. So these are the three main traditional categories of processing. Every single farm and every single coffee packet, even though it might have these same words, will still be processed slightly differently. For example, in Africa, it's very common for the coffee to be dried, or however the processing has been, when it gets to the drying stage of the processing, often they will dry on raised beds. So these are like where the coffee is elevated and it allows a full circulation of air to dry the coffee. In other places, the coffee will be dried directly on concrete patios, and in some even poorer regions, the coffee will be dried directly on soil, which of course, as you can imagine, will impart probably not ideal flavors onto the coffee. So that just as a tiny little note to say that within these categories, there is a huge variety of what this means, but in general, these categories should give you an idea, if a coffee is of a high quality, should give you an idea of the type of flavor and cleanliness and brightness that you will get in the cup. Massive generalization, but yeah. More traditional methods, we have the three that I've just said: washed, honey, and natural. Then you have the more experimental types of fermentation where you can expect some pretty far out flavors if it's done well. Now I'm going to touch on just the traditional methods. What are the differences between them? What does that mean? And yeah, rock and roll. We'll take it from there. So, washed process and natural process. Let's start at the natural end of the spectrum. So you imagine like a spectrum of processing. We're going to start on one end, natural and washed. So naturally processed fruits. Ideally, the ripest cherries will be picked. Those deliciously ripe cherries will go to dry with the seed, the parchment, the mucilage, the skin, and the entire fruit still intact. So it will be the whole coffee cherry goes to dry like that. So in general, in the specialty world, quite a few people don't necessarily prize naturally processed coffees. There are a number of reasons for this, in my opinion. Firstly, so let's say if a natural coffee is processed very, very well, in general, it will not be as clean in the cup. The acidity is muted a little and it's not as clean as a washed processed coffee. Now, rewind. The thing is, naturally processed coffees, in order to do very well, are quite difficult because the drying process is a lot more complicated. If you remove the flesh, the mucilage of the coffee, and also the skin, then of course the seed is a lot easier. Just the seed itself to dry is a lot easier to get even. With naturally processed coffee, they need to be turned often in order to make sure that there's no rot or there's no fermentation. The weather, the climate has to be very particular as well in order for that coffee. Well, it's the same for all of them. It's just if you have more flesh, of course, it's going to take longer for that to dry. There's more things that can go wrong in the process. In general, naturally processed coffees are probably the most traditional way to process and dry coffee because it requires the least amount of work. On the other end of the spectrum, wet coffees require a lot more infrastructure and a lot more water, which in a lot of the coffee growing regions, people don't necessarily have access to. So natural coffees, fruit to dry. Naturally processed coffees in general can also imply that a farm doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure or the knowledge or the education or the water in order to make high quality coffee. So therefore, we can assume in general that people who process in the natural way aren't aware that the riper a coffee cherry is when it's picked, the more flavor we're going to get. So are you with me? Does that make sense? One of the fundamental things that has a huge impact on the flavor of the coffee in the end is the ripeness at which the cherry is picked. And if we have ripe and unripe coffee cherries mixed in together in the processing, then that is not going to taste very good. Yeah. So naturally processed coffees, first things first, it is assumed that if they're processing in this old traditional way, they probably have got unripe and ripe cherries all mixed in together, which will have a profoundly negative impact on the quality of the overall harvest. So naturally processed coffees, ideally ripest cherries are picked, they go to dry. Ideally they dry on raised beds where there is full air circulation and the coffee is constantly turned. Once the fruit and the seed has dried down, then the fruit will be removed, the coffee will go to rest, and then it will eventually be hulled, like the paper will be removed, and then it will be packaged and sent to us here at the studio. All of the coffee, yes, to us. So, natural process, full fruit to dry in the sun. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, washed or wet processed, there are quite a number of more complex steps in between the harvesting of the deliciously ripe fruit and the drying of it. So, in washed or wet processed, it goes like this. Ideally, ripest cherries, hand-picked, they go into flotation tanks. Anything that is underripe or spoiled, for example, a little bug has climbed inside the cherry and eaten its way through and started eating at the coffee seeds. So the borer beetle, for example, fantastic plague, that one. So anything that is not quite right is going to float to the top, and that will be removed, discarded, and sold elsewhere. So what is left is going to be more ripe, more dense fruit that is sunk to the bottom. What happens next? That coffee will go and be sorted again. Anything that looks different will be picked out and removed by hand, usually, so more hand labor. Then the coffee will go into fermentation tanks. Depending on altitude and temperature, the coffee will, with the fruit still intact, will slowly begin to ferment in these tanks. This can last 24 to 72 hours usually. So what happens then? There's a pulping step. So the coffee fruit will go through a pulper, which will remove the outer layer or the skin. So what's left is just the mucilage. Then the fruit with mucilage and the seed will go into the fermentation tanks, be fermented. Then the coffee will be washed and the mucilage will just wash off. What's left is the seed with a little papery layer that we call parchment, and the coffee which is the seed with the parchment still intact, will then go to dry. So they will also either be dried on raised beds or in big concrete slabs, depending on the production line of the farm, wherever they are, on the processing plant. So those are. Thanks for coming on that long journey for me. I hope that I managed to paint a picture. This would be way easier if I could just be there and have a camera to show you, but hopefully I've taken you on a visual journey. You can also Google it after this. So natural, and on the other end of the spectrum, washed processed. So then honey in the middle, there are different grades of honey. We have black honey, golden honey, red honey, and pulped natural. So that's kind of all the same names for this similar kind of in the middle thing. This guy is in between the two because the coffee will be pulped, and depending on the amount of mucilage that is left intact, and then the coffee goes to dry with that mucilage intact. You with me? So it's kind of like in between the two. In general, natural coffees are rounder acidity, bigger body. The coffee fruit can impart flavors on the coffee, will impart flavors on the coffee seeds, which is why some people in the specialty world in general don't necessarily like natural coffees, and also because of the bad rep because of everything I described earlier. I personally have had some beautiful natural coffees. Elbite, how do you say that word? Elbite, but they can be hard to come by. Yeah, love a good Yirgacheffe Ethiopian natural coffee. Superb. Try Guji region. Yum. So washed coffees in general will be cleaner, more complex, brighter in the cup, crisper, in general. So remember, what I'm talking about here is also, hopefully, we are assuming that the entire processing method went well and nothing went wrong. So this is also one thing, like any farmed product, you can have an untimely rain that will completely wipe out an entire crop or an entire harvest. So just like side note is, like, for me, with those of us who work in coffee, myself and maybe you, and then also others on planet Earth, like yourself, I imagine, if you're here with me, then like we as consumers and workers in this industry, we are so lucky and so blessed that we get to enjoy this product. And I think, like, one thing that I really try to impart with the way that I share information is this is an absolute privilege. And it's one of the coolest firstly, we're looking at one of the most aromatic substances for humans on the planet, right? Like, that's so cool. This is a massive privilege. The amount of work that goes into producing this wonderful goodness is astronomical. This is fantastic. This is special. Really, if you like, learning more about coffee is an incredible gift in itself. So cool, man. Just that, it's cool. It's so cool. These are the three more traditional processing methods: washed or wet, honey, pulped natural, dry or natural processed. As I said earlier in the beginning of this video, now we are beginning to see more and more, I guess, like, in a sense, it's like the wine world somehow, or like the fermentation world is beginning to kind of enter into the coffee production regions. Because remember that, like, coffee is produced in regions of the planet that are far, far, far away from us. Like, when I say us, in general, I am referring to Australia, New Zealand, America, like North America and Europe. We lovers of coffee from these regions are very far away from where coffee is grown. This sucks for very many reasons, which I could talk about for 17 hours. But like right now, and if we're just looking at like the processing methods, what we're seeing now is like this kind of marrying of these different worlds where it comes to fermentation with coffee production. So again, traditional methods, super duper fantastic, wonderful, lovely, yes. Now we have more funky processing methods, as I said, anaerobic fermentation, carbonic maceration, lactic fermentation, all of these more experimental processing methods where we're bringing in fermentation from like different fields of knowledge and different culinary schools and wine. There's a lot of, basically, I'm just going to say to you guys, there's a lot of interesting experimental stuff. So if you see something on a package of coffee where it comes up to the process and it's talking about like some lactic fermentation-y thing, you know, you can then therefore know that this producer in general has access to a higher budget. They have access to a far greater field of knowledge than you would expect in a more traditional farm. Generally, not always the case, that generalizations, massive. Yeah, so you can know that it's possible that you're going to have a bit more of a funky, fruity, intense, interesting, delightful cup of coffee. There's no right or wrong, there's no good or bad. It's all about trying, learning, seeing what you like, opening your mind, paying deep attention to the moment in front of you as it passes, tasting that, smelling the aromas, letting them wash over you. Okay, I think I went too far. Anyway, you get the idea. I hope that has summed up enough for you. The general flavors that you'll see on the packets, again, natural, washed, pulped natural, or honey, and then the more experimental methods. So yeah, this is scratching the surface of what this incredible world has to offer. I hope that it's shed some light on something. Again, you know the deal. Any questions, feel free to write them in the comments below and we'll try and get back to you as soon as we can. And yeah, have a beautiful week, guys. Bye.